As we walked down the pier holding hands, I looked at my wife, Natalie. Even though we were approaching 50, she was still as beautiful to me as ever. Perhaps we needed to do more things together to rekindle the flame of love, but the embers were still alive. I glanced around the parking lot to make sure my other great love, my 2013 Mustang Boss 302, was still in order. Then I took Natalie's hand and we started walking around the dock. In addition to other strollers, there were a lot of people on the dock. There was gambling, different kinds of food, and lots of entertainers. I saw jugglers, stilt walkers, singers, musicians, clowns, and even a mime. I hate mimes. We didn't make any specific plans or schedules. We just wanted to spend the day together and rediscover all that we had lost. I didn't think we had lost anything. Perhaps I saw it as a case of our blazing romance simply cooling down over time to a level that we could sustain over a longer period of time. It was as if Natalie thought we still had to constantly smack each other around like we did when we first met. We had been together for a long time and were no longer young and fresh. But that didn't mean I loved her less or that I was less attracted to her. In fact, I may have loved her even more. As the years went by, we became more and more important to each other. We became a part of each other's lives. It would be much harder for me to break up with her now than it would have been shortly after we met. My perspective on all of this was different from hers. She thought we had lost the passion in our relationship. I, on the other hand, was convinced that all we had lost was desperation and insecurity. I took Natalie's hand and pulled her closer to the water as a mime approached us. Take that Marcel, I thought with an evil smirk on my face. Apparently he was a better mime than I thought he was, because he managed to convey how pissed off he was at being ripped off just by the look on his face. Oh, let's take a tour of the lake, Natalie giggled. That looks interesting. I looked at the boat with a mixture of skepticism and outright disdain. The boat didn't seem very seaworthy. Come on, Rob, it'll be fun, Natalie coaxed, and her voice sounded more like the young woman I'd fallen in love with than the one I'd been in recent years. I looked at the boat again. This time I looked at the crew of two. The captain looked like a former athlete who had gone soft. He still had his former mass, but had not retained the definition and hardness of his muscles. He tipped his hat and smiled at us. His long, greasy hair and yellow-toothed smile reminded me more of a biker mom than any sense of seamanship. The only person who made me feel safe was his crewman. This guy was one of the people who blew it. Even as he was walking up the gangway to stand next to the captain, who was standing at the safety rail on deck, he tripped over seemingly nothing and nearly fell overboard. And the vessel itself? Was she called the Guppy? She looked like she was left over from the war. The Revolutionary War. There's no way I'm getting on that boat. Come on, Rob, she said. I need a big, strong husband to protect me from the dangers of the sea. Don't worry, sir, said the captain. This is just a little tour of some of the interesting places around the Great Lakes. We'll show you the coolest hidden islands and the most famous shipwrecks in history. Will you show the area where the Edmund Fitzgerald sank? I asked. Are you high up? He asked. I've been sailing these waters since I was 12 years old and I'm still afraid of this place. He looked at me as if there was something wrong with me. I noticed Natalie looking at me too, like I had done something wrong. I was about to just take her hand and head home, but then one of the team members intervened. I love all these mysterious islands in the lakes, he said. Some of them are undiscovered and some are haunted. One of them is said to have an Indian chief living on it that boats can't get near because of the high winds and crazy waves. Perhaps we can sail past him. But don't we run the risk of drowning? I asked. This boat doesn't seem to be very seaworthy. No, said the captain. This island is only dangerous in November. In summer, as now, it is perfectly safe. But a few months will pass, and the place will be like hell on earth. The winds there blow so strong they strip the paint off the hull. I've heard of waves 50 feet high coming out of nowhere and moving like freight trains. Wow, have you ever seen one of those? I asked. He stared at me again like I was a fleeing idiot. If I had, I wouldn't be talking to you right now, he said. Again, I noticed that my wife seemed to be on the side of this vulgar, tuna-smelling boat jockey. Rumor has it that this Indian, I mean Native American, is some kind of shaman, and he's in love with the spirit of the Great Lakes. I have heard of strange purple lightning and otherworldly screams coming from there in the fall. Some say it was such conditions that ruined the Fitzgerald. I've also heard that the storm followed the ship from the island to its final resting place. So we may not go to the spot where the Fitz sank, but we may pass close to the island. I nodded my head and paid for the tour. I decided that if I had to spend the next 3 hours with my cheating wife, I'd better do something interesting. And I looked at the passengers who were already on board and saw what could be described as a truly motley crew. Among them was a group of 4 women of about 25 who were already beginning to whisper and giggle. 2 of them were quite pleasant-looking, if not average. The other 2 also fit the expected stereotypes. One was a tall, well-built blonde goddess who needed to check her lipstick every 17 seconds. I imagined her actually pulling out her makeup bag and occasionally looking away from everyone because she was using the mirror to look around and make sure everyone could see her. Last in their company was, of course, the fat lady. Although she wasn't comically obese, she was denser than all of her friends and it clearly bothered her. She wore pants instead of shorts and a long-sleeved blouse to cover her fat arms. But of course, in the good old tradition of her kind, the blouse was cut low enough to emphasize the virtues she was most proud of. Somewhere near the chattering women sat a guy. That's the only way I can describe him. He was just a regular guy. If I wasn't already me, I would have thought he was just that. Like me, he was in his early 40s. He was of average height and build, neither thin nor fat. His hair, like mine, was brown and had yet to go bald or gray. In short, he was a regular guy. There was another woman standing next to him. It was a very light-skinned Negro woman. She seemed to be alone. She was very attractive and could probably become very pretty if she put on makeup. Her long, thick and silky hair was thrown back from her face and tied up in a very severe bundle. The clothes she was wearing were very loose and did not emphasize or take anything away from her body. I also could not make out the contours of her figure, but I could tell from her arms and hands that she was relatively thin. Across from her, but clearly not with her, sat 2 nerdy guys. They were both small in stature, wearing huge glasses, and were discussing something that looked like schoolwork. The captain and his first mate began to prepare the ship for departure from the dock. Just as they began to untie the ropes holding the boat to the dock, 2 more guys appeared. They each handed the captain a few bills and then climbed aboard the boat. They looked around and sat down next to the women. Both were big guys and relatively young. One of them walked around looking like he thought he was the master of the world, and the other was his assistant. It seemed the second guy was paid to agree with everything the big blonde guy said. I noticed that Natalie seemed to take a special interest in the last 2 arrivals, much more so than anyone else on board. I stood up, walked over, and sat at the other end of the boat. A few minutes later, she came over and sat down next to me. Nat, maybe you should go back to where you were sitting, I said. Why, Rob? She asked. I'm beginning to see where you're going with this, I said. Maybe we've drifted apart over the years. I guess I never noticed it. I always thought things were fine between us. I guess I thought we still loved each other, and even though we've gotten older, we're still the same people. But we are the same people, she said. Maybe we've made some mistakes. Maybe we've prioritized our marriage and we need to get back to what matters most. That's what today was about. We just need to spend more time together and rediscover what we fell in love with. We need to put the past behind us and step into the future together. I think we've drifted apart a little bit, but not so much that we've become the same. I looked at her, and she seemed sincere. She seemed to be begging for it, but I didn't understand. Well, if we are different, I began, maybe we should do what Steve and Edie did. Rob, we don't need to do that, she said. Our case isn't like theirs at all. And I don't know if you're in touch with Steve, but Edith is miserable. All the shit she's been through has aged her prematurely, and she's not happy anymore. We just need to get to know the people we've become over the years, she said. She put her arms around me and rubbed her palm against my cheek like she did when we first started dating. I sighed, realizing that it had been years since she had done that. It was amazing how much such small gestures could mean. I wanted us to talk about something today, she said. But with the mood we're in right now, it might have to wait. Let's just have a good time and see if the captain and his Great Lakes scary tour can entertain us. We can talk about anything, whatever it is, I said. I'm in no mood for nonsense. I'll take my bad news straight. Rob, that's not the point. When people are together for a long time, they take life at different speeds and... You mean we've drifted apart, which is what you've been implying all morning, I snapped back. In short, you're sick of us and you want a divorce. And since the kids are already out of the house and in college, now seems like a good time. She looked at me with absolute horror in her eyes. Rob, what makes you think that's what I want? She asked. You should know that more than anything I want us to be together. She took my hands in hers and looked into my eyes. Rob, we've done our duty to society. We've raised two wonderful children. Sure, we've both made some mistakes, but you're still the person I want to spend the rest of my life with, and I can't say, I replied. What kind of woman is this who constantly takes the side of another man over her husband? I'm not sure I want to be married to a woman like that. What do you mean, Rob? You're not jealous of me for the captain, are you? She laughed and squeezed my hand even tighter. Rob, I was just about to tell you that we've raised the kids, our mortgage is quite affordable, and we did it before we turned 50. We're riding the train and heading toward the finish line, but I think we're looking at things differently. I think you want us to keep saving, and you're going to keep working at your job for another 18 years until you're ready to retire at 65. That's what normal people do, I said. She interrupted me with a look. That's why normal people die or get too old to do anything with their lives, she snorted. Today is the beginning for us, Rob. It's not the end. I'm not telling you I want a divorce. I'm telling you I want us to get to know each other again. I want you to cut back on your hours and start using the vacation time you have. I want us to take trips, go camping, and visit all the curiosities we've heard about. I want you to make me remember why all my girlfriends think you are so special and so cute. I want us to spend the rest of our lives falling in love with each other all over again. Before I could answer her, there was an explosion of vibration and engine noise as the good ship Guppy pulled away from the dock. The motion of the ship was not as smooth as one might expect, but the captain and his mate seemed to be used to it by now. As we moved farther and farther away from shore, safety and my Mustang, I became accustomed to the erratic nature of the vessel. It is not a machine, I said to myself. Therefore, I shouldn't expect it to feel like a car. Lake Superior is huge. In area, it is the largest freshwater lake in the world. It is also the world's largest real lake. Only the Caspian Sea, which is not really a lake, is bigger than it. It is a sea, but because it is completely surrounded by land, it meets the definition of a lake to a small degree. The lake is so large that if we were lost, it would take days or weeks to find it. The lake has an area of over 36,000 square miles. That's a huge area to search, said the captain. He went on at length about the lake, touching 3 separate states and an entire country. But fear not, boys, he said, grinning. I know this lake as well as I know my own bathtub. That made most of the passengers laugh, including Natalie, but it didn't move me much. I had 2 different thoughts. The first was that there was a rather unpleasant fishy odor coming from the captain. His first mate didn't have one, so perhaps the captain didn't know his tub that well. The second thought was that perhaps the lake was the captain's bathtub. That would explain why he smelled like bloody fish. True to my word, for at least the first hour or so, we drove in the same direction from our starting point. I noticed a few minor course changes depending on the position of the sun, but the more we drove, the more I became fascinated with the captain's stories about the Great Lakes. Several times during our excursion, I noticed First Mate Gill looking up at the sky. As I mentioned, the movement of the Guppy on the water was never smooth. But after about 80 minutes, I noticed that the swell of the water and the roughness of the Guppy's motion had increased dramatically. When we first set out, the sun was high in the sky and there were few clouds. The sun had set behind the clouds several times during the trip, and in the heat of the day, we were glad of the respite from the sun's rays. But now, the whole sky was filled with dark, angry clouds. I realized that Jill had seen these clouds far and wide, and they were the ones he was watching. I hate to interrupt our excursion, said the captain, but we are quite close to the mysterious island I warned some of you about. The waters approaching this island are known for their unpredictability, and though we cannot see the island, the High One seems to be quite alarmed. Perhaps I should not have spoken of this island aloud. At first I thought he was just stirring up drama to cover up his ineptitude. What sailor doesn't keep an eye on the weather? Even Jill, who I was sure wasn't too tight-lipped, noticed the clouds. But even as the captain spoke, lightning flashed very close to the ship. Huge raindrops suddenly started falling on the water, and all the passengers left the deck and went to the cramped crew quarters below deck. The weather began to deteriorate, and the little boat began to toss. I had to give credit to the captain and Jill. They had done their jobs courageously, and it was they, more than anyone else, who had kept the boat from going down. Wait a minute. I should rephrase that. Perhaps it would be better, or at least clearer, if I said, the weather began to turn bad. The tiny craft began to toss. Had it not been for the bravery of the intrepid crew, the minnow, that is, the guppy, would have perished. Looking at the frightened and angry faces of the passengers around me, I realized that all of us were already regretting having boarded the guppy. I heard several people saying the same thing I was. They were expressing the same concerns. The boat didn't look to be in the best condition, and the captain smelled like fish. Jill seemed an idiot at best. And now our lives were in their hands. I'm going to sue, one of the women said. Who are you going to sue? The man I called just a guy asked. The captain probably owns the boat, and apparently the boat is all he owns. If the boat goes down, what do you get? Maybe you get title to a sunken, worthless boat? Yeah, and then you'll be charged all sorts of fines for cleaning it up so you don't damage the lake's ecosystem and such, one of the nerds said. The nerd next to him didn't utter a word. He just turned green and ran over to a small sink in the galley. He immediately emptied the contents of his stomach and did so very loudly. He may have been the only one throwing up, but he wasn't the only one not enjoying the ride. As the boat rose and fell and crashed against the waves, we all screamed and begged for the ride to be over sooner rather than later. Are we close to that island you told us about yet? I asked, scared to death. No, replied the captain. That island is at least half an hour away from us. For the next few minutes, the passage of time and my senses seemed to go crazy. I looked at my watch, and although it seemed like hours had passed, it was more like 5 minutes. The normal up and down motion that the boat made as it floated on the water was gone. The boat was now moving in all directions and orientations and seemed haphazard. The bow of the boat was often pointing straight up and sometimes straight down and at an angle. We were being tossed around the cabin and slammed against the walls, seemingly with some malicious outside intent. Natalie clung to me as best she could, and I tried my best to reassure her that everything would be all right. We weren't so much talking as we were exchanging phrases. We'd bounce off the wall, and I'd say, "Wow, that was really hard." Then we'd slide to the floor, and I'd yell, "They're making us move forward." I was trying to be manly. I was doing it more for her than for me. However, I noticed that many of the men were freaking out. The big muscular guy squealed like a little girl. But I couldn't take offense at him. He was young and realized that he and all of us could die. Letting it all out was helpful. The nerds were screaming too. The women were screaming almost as loud as the muscular guy. Then I noticed two things. First, a guy who looked like me was doing the same thing I was doing. He was looking for the best and strongest places on the boat to hold on to, and positioning himself so that every time the boat moved, he would increase the security of his position. The single woman was doing the same thing. This amazed me more than anything else. After that, I was too stunned to notice anything when the boat hit something very hard and a huge ripping sound overrode everything else. And then I looked at the wall in front of me and saw a huge hole in the side with water rushing through it. "We need to get out of here," I shouted. "Come on, get back on deck. With that big hole in the side, this boat is going to go down." As soon as I said this, a muscular fellow squeezed past the women, jerked open the door, and ran out on deck. I helped one of the plain women to her feet and at the same time helped a fat woman to her feet. Then I lifted Natalie up onto the deck. Ta-da! The captain didn't insist that we put on life jackets, and I started to look for where they were kept. "What do we do now?" a muscular guy asked me. He looked terrified. "I'm trying to find life jackets in case we have to go down in the water," I said. "Yeah, me too," he said. He started opening cabinets. The captain and Jill were busy trying to find something to patch the hole in the ship and trying to radio someone to report our situation and ask for help. I pulled out my cell phone and noticed there was no signal. The rain had eased, but the strong wind was still rattling the ship like a cork in a bathtub. When you add to that the fact that the boat had a very clear listing, I think we all got a little scared. One of the women found the life jackets. "I found them!" she shouted. A muscular guy quickly walked over to her, pushed her aside, and then grabbed a life jacket. He quickly put it on and then started handing it out to everyone else. At that moment, the boat hit something very hard. The impact was so hard that we were all knocked off our feet. I saw the captain literally fly out from under his feet and land unsuccessfully on his back and shoulders. When he landed, there was an eerie cracking sound and then he was left lying motionless. We all grabbed onto something to hold on to. Natalie grabbed me and sat next to me, whimpering, for several long, scary moments. During this time, we noticed that the boat had stopped moving. I crawled over to the captain and called for Jill. I groped the captain's neck until I was sure he had no pulse. Then I looked at Gil and shook my head. The captain's dead, isn't he? The muscular guy wheezed. I nodded. Oh, that's just great, he whined. How the hell are we going to get home now? I looked around and noticed that the boat had indeed run aground. I climbed over the side and noticed that we were on a rather large piece of land that we had somehow stumbled onto during the storm. The rest of us got out of the boat too and followed me. We ended up on a fairly large beach. Jill, do you think there's any chance of patching the hole in the side of the boat? I asked. He only looked at me. What the hell are you asking him for? The muscular guy asked. Well, because he's the captain now, so he's in charge. We need to come up with a plan and figure out how the hell we're going to get off this island or signal the authorities to let them know we're here. I said. We don't need to do any of that, Grandpa, he said. Everything happens automatically now. As soon as the company notices that communication with one of their ships has broken down, they'll track us down. All we have to do is sit and wait. To tell you the truth, I don't believe a word this jackass says. He and his buddy almost got us killed. That guy was a real captain. I ignored him and started walking down the beach. As I stepped away from the group, I noticed I was being followed. I turned around and saw that I was being followed by Jill, a guy and a pretty black woman. The guy, who was just a guy, caught up with me. Are you scouting the island? He asked. I nodded. We need to know what's out here in case the rescue this steroid guy was talking about doesn't come. I know it's stupid, but there's no storm expected this afternoon. It should be out tonight and tomorrow afternoon, I said. George Ignikowski, he said, holding out his hand. Robert Sinclair, I said. George, I think we'll cover more ground if we split into 2 teams. Gil and I will go east, and you and this lady will go west. Does your watch still work? Yes, he said. Let's meet on the beach in an hour. It won't be more than 3 or 4 hours before sunset. By then the storm will probably have started if it hasn't already. We're looking for a cave or any other natural formation where we can build a shelter in a short time. He nodded and we left. As Jill and I moved around the island, he seemed to come out of his shock. How do you know this way is the eastern way? He asked. The sun sets in the west, I said. He nodded. You learned that in a survival course, right? He asked. No, I watched a lot of cowboy movies as a kid, I smiled. We saw several natural rock formations that might be suitable, but we would need materials to make them livable. We noticed many thin but sturdy trees and a few large trees from which we could cut or break off long, thin branches. From talking with Jill, I got a pretty good idea of what supplies and tools were available aboard the boat. So after an hour, I had a pretty good idea of what we needed to do to survive the storm in relative comfort. I sent Jill back to the boat with a list of what we needed to take with us. I went back to the beach to explain to him what we had found and tell him the plan. Unless George offered a better place, we would make do with what I had. Time was running out, so we needed to do something fast. I'd only been gone about an hour, and it was probably pure luck that I took the exact route I came back on. This section was a little more wooded than the others. I found out later that they decided to use the safety in numbers strategy. So whenever someone needed to go to the restroom, 2 people went there. All the women went in 2s. Unfortunately, or perhaps out of calculation, when Natalie went in there were no women available, so she went with him. I could hear their conversation as I approached them. I didn't try to walk quietly until I heard her voice. But aren't you married? He asked. That's nothing new, she replied. I've been expanding my horizons for a few years now. My friend got caught and I decided to quit, but maybe now isn't the right time for that. Then I heard a sound I recognized all too easily. I knew what was going on and I knew what I heard, but somehow that wasn't enough. I crept closer and saw my wife. I thought she heard me, but she looked in the direction they came from. I saw her looking toward the beach, checking to see if everything was in place. Why did you stop? He asked. We were just getting started. Just remember that young girls are prettier, she said. But they won't be able to do all the things I'm going to do. What about your husband? He snorted. What he doesn't know won't hurt him, she said. You can always give him something to do to make him feel important, like send him on a scouting mission or something. I guess I should have been shocked, but once she told me that she'd been deceiving me for years, everything fell into place. I realized the reason she suddenly decided we needed to open up to each other again, and everything made sense. She'd spun around with Edie, and when Edie got caught, Natalie didn't. She'd seen what Edie had ended up doing, and she didn't want that to happen to her, so she launched the whole rekindled romance thing at me. Even more hurtful than the betrayal itself was that she did it so coldly. She didn't even think about me. Being a practical person, I put it behind me. Heartbroken or not, the storm was still coming. I walked away from the forest and approached the beach from the other side. As I approached the beach, I saw George and the woman he left with coming from the other side. We met in the center and George shook his head. "We found a small cave," he said, "but it's hardly big enough for all of us." The woman tugged at his sleeve. "Oh yes, we found some berry trees. Some of them are ripe. I saw a bunch of squirrels. Jill and I found a natural rock ledge that will work for this night. We can use the tarp that Jill said they had on board and some rope. We'll need to make some sort of framework to reinforce the tarpaulin and use it as a wall to keep the storm from blowing it away. But we'll need to get started on that pretty soon, We're not doing any of that," came a voice from behind me. "While you guys were on your little hunting expedition, we had an election. After all, this is still the United States, and I'm in charge here." I noticed the two nerds and the idiot friend nod their heads in agreement. The other four women did as well. "So we can't vote?" George asked. "It doesn't matter," said the muscular guy. "There are only 4 of you. There were 9 people here. Anyway, I've decided that if the rescuers don't arrive tonight, and I'm sure they will, we'll just spend the night on the boat. Why should we waste time, energy, and effort building when we have a boat?" George and I shrugged and headed toward the spot I had chosen. "Hey," the muscular guy called out, "where are you going?" "There's a storm coming," I said. "We don't have time to waste on you." "But I'm in charge here," he said. "We didn't vote for you." "So you're not in charge of us," George said. "What about your wife?" shouted the guy. "She's with us. Don't you want to try to convince her to come with you or try to fight for her?" "You've already said that," I replied. "She's with you." I looked straight into Natalie's eyes and she sighed. "I only fight for what I think is worth it." "But Rob," Natalie whined. "Yeah!" George, the quiet woman, and I started to leave the beach. As we were leaving, a stocky woman ran up to us. "Dana, where are you going?" one of the women asked. "Look, Peggy, I already know how this movie ends," said Dana. 4 guys, 5 women, and me, the fat lady. I'll take my chances on the other side. Truth be told, they seem to have a plan, and they have their reasons. I hope so. Once we reached the place I'd found earlier, we all introduced ourselves. The stocky girl's name was Dana. The quiet girl's name was Ella. Ella was wonderful. She didn't talk much because she didn't like to explain her accent. She was a mutt, as she called herself. Her father was half black, half Hispanic. Her mother was Irish who lived in England. Ella grew up in London and had an accent. She was a librarian and very proud of it. George, like me, was an engineer. The difference was that he was a mechanic, and I was a manufacturing engineer. I told him about my idea of how to fortify the site. The site I had chosen was on the side of a fairly steep hill. There was a vertical notch on one side of the hill. It resembled the letter V turned on its side. The idea was to build a fairly large shelter that would take advantage of the sheer wall against its back and blend in with the slope. As a bonus, there were several large rocks and fallen trees that we could put in front of the canopy when we got settled. To further protect it from the wind, since the tarp was waterproof, I wasn't as worried about the rain as I was about the wind. Soon Jill arrived and we filled it up. The tarp was bigger than I expected and thicker. We filled it up and I sent it on another trip. George decided to start construction. Dana and I went looking for limbs to staple together to build walls, and Ella went back to picking berries she had seen earlier and anything edible she could find. While Dana and I searched for the right-sized limbs, we talked and I kept an eye out for small pieces of dry wood. I expected it might get cold at night, so I asked Jill to bring a couple items I had seen on the boat that might be useful for making a fire. Ella returned with berries that would be more than enough for the 5 of us. I jabbed my finger at her and she smiled and came over to me. I held out the fishing rod to her. What should I use as bait? She asked. She asked. The exact syllable of her words was magical. What did you say? I asked. She smiled and repeated her question. I pretended again that I hadn't heard her. Dana came over and said George had enough poles for the 2 layers of wall we needed. Does it have to do with color? Ella asked. What do you mean? I asked. I asked you the same question 2 or 3 times, but you didn't hear me, she said. But when Dana came over, you heard her right away, answered her question, and sent her away. I'm sorry, I said. And it's not about skin color. Hell, you probably have lighter skin than I do. So it's a cultural trait? She asked, looking at me like she was really disappointed. Ella, that's stupid, I said, and I'm sorry. You think I'm stupid, she sighed. I'll tell you, my good man. Here I burst into laughter. Ella, I never said you were a fool, I laughed. I meant that I am. She calmed down and looked at me. I highly doubt you're stupid, she said. And since we're all following your plan, if I'm wrong, we'll all suffer. Ella, I made you repeat yourself because I love hearing you speak, I said. Your accent, your tone of voice, even the phrases you use are just magical. I could listen to you forever. We both blushed and walked away. Ella, I called out as she picked up the pole. There are all kinds of worms on the ground near some of the muddy areas. Try using them, and also the berries as bait. After a few minutes, she came over, took my hand, and pulled me toward the puddle. Put this on my hook, she said, pointing to a big fat worm. George began to drive the long spars into the hillside. If you looked from a distance, you could hardly see them because he was very precise in his approach to the corner of the hill. The next step would be to lay a tarp over them and then another layer of spars to protect the tarp from the strong winds. I had Jill take a large flat metal disc he brought from the boat and put that in the center of the big fire pit too. I put a lot of crumpled paper, brushwood, and pieces of dry wood that I had managed to gather there. A few neatly stacked metal skewers, and we had both heat and a stove. Jill had brought a few bottles of water and 3 cans of soda with him on his last trip. Clouds appeared in the sky. We all had to push a large rock and a split stump in front of the wall. We made blankets out of small pieces of tarpaulin. We also had life jackets, which we stretched out and piled up to serve as mattresses. Finally, when Ella came up to us with 3 decent-sized fish, we were all set. That's all I caught, she said. I've got them, George said. I'm filleting them. I had Jill take the first one off the hook, Ella said proudly. And I noticed that the other 2 fish were still tied to the lines on the poles. Ella reached out to me as George released her from the fish and rods. I'll just eat berries, she said. I just don't like sushi. Well, I'm not a sushi lover, I said. What do you think of this? I pointed to my makeshift stove. I don't know, what is it? She asked. We're going to cook the fish you caught in there. I smiled at her. Smart boy, she smiled back. I might have to eat some after all. Ella, we really don't know how long we'll be here. We won't be able to survive and keep our strength up with just berries and greens. So whenever any kind of protein comes along, eat it. Whether it's fish or squirrel or anything else we find, even if it tastes like fried shit, eat it, okay? She nodded. Rob? She called out. I turned and looked at her. I was just wondering, she said in her musical voice, what exactly does fried shit look like? We both burst into laughter, and soon everyone was coming over to see what was so funny. Before we could explain, we felt the first drops of rain. We went inside our hastily built structure. We left the flap behind the rocks open and pushed the log as close as we could. After several attempts, I lit a fire with a lighter. The small fire and the open flap provided some light. I took a skewer and threaded on it Ella's fish, which George had filleted. I turned them very slowly every few moments. The smell of the cooking fish was tantalizing. And while we waited for the fish to cook, we took turns telling the others about ourselves. Dana was full of questions. I feel good, she said. Considering the circumstances, I feel pretty good. But why didn't we want to wait out the storm in the boat with the others? Because the boat is sitting very precariously on the very shard of rock that split her hull, I said. She's unstable. Once the wind picks up and the tide comes in, any one of them could lift the boat off that rock, I said. You mean they can sail away without us? She asked. I mean they can swim to the bottom of the lake, I said. The lake is over 1,000 feet deep in some places, said Jill. What about your wife? Ella asked. I'm sure she can swim, I said. There was a silence in the tent and the crackling of a small fire. Everyone looked away from me in embarrassment. Listen, guys, I said. Natalie and I were supposed to spend today getting to know each other again. I didn't think we needed to. It was her idea. A couple hours ago, I caught her doing something she shouldn't have done if she wanted to stay married to me. I also overheard her telling the person she was doing it with about how she had been cheating on me for several years. So as far as I'm concerned, whether we get off this island or are stuck here for years to come, our marriage is over. It wasn't love that suddenly made her want to get close to us. It was fear of being caught, mixed with guilt. In a way, I'm glad I found out. Now I can get rid of her and find someone else to spend the rest of my life with before I'm too old to start over. So get rid of the bad garbage and let's eat. We ate fish and berries, drank water or soda, and talked about other things, including what we would do the next day, until we fell asleep to the howling wind and rain whipping through the canopy. We built it well, so we stayed warm and dry. The next morning, we all got up to do the chores we had decided to do the night before. Dana had to level and tidy up the barn. Ella did the fishing. George was hunting for any small game he could find and for berries. Gil and I were going to try to make some kind of signal that would be visible to passing ships. Dana also wanted to visit her friends. Jill, George, and I got our heads together and came up with two practical ideas for signaling devices. One was to build a bonfire that could be lit instantly and would give both fire and smoke. The bonfire would be clearly visible at night, but the smoke would be much more noticeable during daylight hours. We also decided to try installing a large head-mounted mirror in the boat. This would be a great way to signal during the day, plus it didn't require a campfire or power source. We decided to head for the mirror first. When we got to the shore, our first thought was that maybe they were still on the boat. But then we saw that they were all huddled around a tree, trying to hug each other to keep warm. I knew they would dry out during the heat of the day, but it was still a little chilly and it looked like they were freezing. Then we noticed the boat had disappeared. They saw us about the same time we realized the boat had sunk. Natalie and one of the young women got up and staggered toward us. One of the botanists was walking with them. They looked horrified. "Why didn't you tell us the boat was going to sink?" The botanist asked. "You knew, didn't you?" "How are you guys drying out?" Natalie asked. I ignored her. "Rob, we need to talk, honey," she said. "I have a feeling you're mad about something." "Okay, I did it again. I didn't take your side. Obviously, I was wrong and—" "Jill, let's swim out and see how far the boat is below the surface," I said. "We can always dry our clothes by the fire. Hopefully they'll have something to eat when we get back." Everyone else turned their heads in our direction when I said that. "Where did you get the food?" the muscular guy asked through clattering teeth. "You stole all the food off the boat, didn't you?" "Of course not," said Jill. "There's plenty of food on the island. You just have to know what to look for and work together to get it." "Show us," said Mr. Muscle. "We have things to do," I said. "Since you're in charge here, you should get off your ass and figure out what to do next. But as I recall from the weather forecast, it's supposed to rain again today." "What does it mean to work together?" one of the nerds asked. "We all have different jobs in different parts of the plan," I told them. "Some of us are in charge of cleaning up the area. Others are working on getting food. Some of us will be working on how to signal boats from a long distance." "You've obviously taken all the good people," Mr. Musk said. "That's not fair." "You left me a bunch of useless women and nerds," he continued. "I thought nerds were supposed to be smart, and these guys only know comic books and Lord of the Rings. It's very unfair. We should all get together and be one group again." "I'll talk to the rest of our group over lunch and see what they have to say," I said. "Why don't you just tell them?" he said. "Because no one in our group decides what to do," I said. "We discuss things and act on the ideas we think will work. Each of us has an opinion, and each of us has a job to do." "Why aren't you guys wet?" the blonde asked. Her makeup was running down her face, she was cold, and she looked just awful. "Our shelter is dry and windproof," Jill said, "and we're all very warm by the fire." "Where did you find shelter?" Mr. Muscle asked. "We didn't find it, we built it," said Gil. "Rob came up with the design. Ig? That's what we call George Ignikowski. Ig built it. Dana made it comfortable." We're clearly having fun with the wrong guys, the blonde hisses. Jill and I dove into the water and swam to the rocky edge of the island. The boat was there, but it was at least 8 feet below the surface of the water. I took a deep breath and swam down. I stayed underwater as long as I could, but I never managed to get my head behind the mirror. Jill, however, did much better than I did. He came up with a little hibachi grill. "Not that I don't like the way you cooked last night," he said, "but it'll be a lot easier this way." The other group started to follow us as we left. I turned and addressed them. "Less than 24 hours ago, you all made some very stupid decisions," I said. "You're all lucky you didn't drown when the boat went down. I'll talk to our group and see what they have to say about getting back together. We'll let you know." Natalie was still looking at me. "Where are you going?" I asked. "With you," she said. "We're married, remember?" In the coldest voice I was capable of, I told her. "Yesterday, when you were entertaining that asshole, you told him that what I didn't know wouldn't hurt me. You were wrong, Nat. I know now, and it doesn't hurt me much. I'm ready to put you in the past behind me. As soon as we get off this island, we'll divorce. It's over between us." No, she just stood there in shock as Jill and I walked away. For the next 3 days, the two groups communicated minimally. My group thrived. We found a way to use several long sections of pipe from the ship as makeshift tubes. This allowed us to stay underwater long enough to get a mirror and other necessities. The only real contact between the two groups was maintained by Dana. She visited her friends every day and came back with horror stories. The other group was supposedly close to starvation and despair. Troy, a muscle guy, turned into a pocket tyrant. He ruled his group through fear and intimidation. All the women, except Natalie, wanted to move to our group, but they were afraid Troy would do it. Dana looked at me when she said Natalie was depressed. "I'm not saying it's your fault," she said, "but she feels like you've just written her off." "Yeah," I said. "What else was I supposed to do? How would you feel if you found out that for the last 20-odd years you've been working for the good of a man? You loved him with all your heart. You did everything you could to make him happy, and suddenly you find out that he's been cheating on you for years. Damn, I wish I could start the divorce while we're on this island so I could get rid of her ass even sooner." "Don't you want to talk to her?" Dana asked. "Don't you want to know why this happened?" "And what does that change?" I asked. "Why she did what she did is irrelevant. The fact that she did it, and more than once, tells me that I don't want to be married to her anymore. I'm just lucky I found a woman like that. It's over. I'm not going to turn into a bitter old man who hates all women. I'm sure I'll find someone who looks at things the same way I do." That morning, I got up early to head to our section of rock that was closest to the water. We shared the island with another group. The beach was on their section. It was a good deal because most of the fish seemed to stay away from the beach, but there were plenty of them around our cliff. As I walked over to the cliff to check out the pole we had set up in the rock to attach a large mirror to it, I spotted Ella. She was sitting on the edge of the cliff catching fish. Over the past few days, we had split into pairs, with the exception of Jill. Dana and Ig seemed to be spending a lot of time together, and Ella seemed to be looking for me most of the time. We sat together at meals, and at night she slept next to me, often rolling over onto her back when it got chilly, but that was where it ended. I wasn't sure I could say the same about Iga and Dana, despite their age difference. I was just about to walk up to her when I saw them. Troy, his buddy, and 2 nerds came out of the woods that separated the beach from our neighborhood. They headed straight for Ella. Troy grabbed her arm and tried to pull her in the direction they came from. I ran as fast as I could and didn't slow down until I reached them. I pushed Troy away from her and stepped between them. "What are you doing, old man?" Troy asked. "This isn't your part of the island," I said. "We kind of have an unspoken agreement, since we don't believe in each other's ideas." As I spoke, Natalie and the young women approached. On the other side came Dana, Ig, and Gil. "This is the side that Gil, Ig, and I chose while you sat on your fat steroid ass and said we were wasting our time. This is the land of Gil, Ig, and me. This is the land of Gil, Ig, and me. This is Dana and Ella's land. Your place is on the other side." "Did he say it was Gilligan's Island?" one of the women asked. "I'm tired of all this shit," Troy shouted. "I'm tired of being hungry. I'm tired of being thirsty. I'm tired of being roasted by the sun most of the day and freezing at night. I've messed up everything. I picked the wrong people. I thought that if Dave and I were the strongest guys on the island and my nerds were the smartest, we'd get the best of both worlds. Turns out my nerds are useless. They have 3 or 4 PhDs for 2 of them. But who needs a degree in particle physics when you're stuck on an island in the middle of nowhere? Then I thought we had all women, but somehow you kept the prettiest one for yourself. I think we need to share some of the resources on this island to make it fair for everyone. You and the other old man are obviously the brains here, and your girl is a hunter and gatherer. If I take her, I get food. And since you want her back, you'll build me a place to live or even give me your own, won't you, Papa? No, I said. Bullshit, he spat again. The fat lady comes over every day to chat with her girlfriends. And while those stupid girls are chatting with her, I'm eavesdropping. I know they all want to come and stay with you guys. I've heard all their bullshit about not having any food. Dana used to bring them little bits of squirrel and fish. And she was talking about all of you guys. I know what the fat lady is doing to the other old man. And I know you and the little English girl didn't do anything, but you like each other. So all you have to do is decide if you're going to build me a house just like yours, or just give me yours. No, I repeated. So you won't even try to get it back? He asked. I won't have to, I said. You're not taking her back. Before I could say a word, I didn't. A huge fist came out of nowhere and slammed into my mouth with such force that I recoiled. Guess you weren't smart enough to see that coming, he muttered. You're smart and all, but it's about time someone showed you your place here. As soon as I stood up, he punched me again, this time his fist hitting me in the eye. Stop, a woman's voice said. Don't hit him again. I will go with you. I'll fish and bring you berries and anything else you want. Just leave him alone. Smart girl, he said. He stood over me and I got angry. I hadn't fought since high school. No, I repeated, and exaggerating my lack of balance, rose to my feet. I have to admit, for an old man, you've got balls, he laughed. You're the only one who can stand up to me. I clenched my fist and took a clumsy swing at him. I missed him by a full mile on purpose. We don't have to do this, Pops, he said, but I'm curious to know one thing. Why are you so willing to fight for her, even though you wouldn't fight for your own wife? It's simple, I said, still trying to stay on my feet. Ella is worth it. I stepped close to him and clenched my fist again. He smiled. I threw my fist out clumsily and he leaned back. Then I pulled back and kicked him in the balls with all my might. I was sure his scream could be heard all over Lake Superior and all the way home. When he leaned forward to grab his aching hour weights, I brought my knee up and smacked him in the face. He spit out a couple teeth and tried to grab me. I punched him in the side with my fist and he went down. His outstretched arm crunched as he fell to the rocky ground. His handmaiden looked at me in shock. You were faking it, he said. You weren't in that condition, that's cheating. I laughed. He's 6 inches taller than me. He weighs more than me, probably 80 pounds, and he has a lot more potential than I do. Plus, he's 20 years younger and in better physical shape. You call that a fair fight? He was desperate, Dave said. We don't know shit about surviving. Troy always had a temper and always thought he should be in charge. When we were on the boat, you always decided what we should do. Even during a storm, Troy would scream like a girl. It embarrassed him, and he had to work up his courage afterward. While you went off to find the island, he turned everything into a popularity contest and had his own election. You should have agreed with him, but you just left us where we were. I think you were more angry with your wife than anything else. And you can't blame Troy for your wife. He's a guy. She proposed, he accepted. She's not even his type, she's too old for us. It was just fun. I thought it was cool because it meant I got Blondie with water wings. Now that's a disappointment. Screw you, Dave, Blondie hissed. You've done this before, several times, Dave said. And it's not that great. The blonde, who didn't look that good at all without makeup, stood and grunted. At that moment, Troy woke up. Dude, are you okay? Dave asked. Troy tried to get up and suddenly screamed so loud he almost passed out. What happened to your balls now? Dave asked. It's my hand, Troy wheezed. I could see that his arm was dislocated. I grabbed his shoulders, trying not to move his arm. He recoiled from me even as I touched him. Careful, asshole, I snapped at him. Your shoulder's out of the socket. The longer it stays in that position, the worse the pain and damage will be. So what are you going to do? He asked. If you lie down and shut up, I'll put it back in the socket, or try to, I said. I grabbed his arm and planted both feet against his side. I yanked fast and very hard. He cried out again and then gasped. "Oh shit, that feels good," he said. "You need a bandage on your arm," I said. "It's going to be very sore for the next week or so. And after the pain goes away, it'll be weaker than the other one for a while. You should go back to your part of the island and rest." Dave helped him to his feet and they all left. As they left, there was a sense of discontent in the room. I suspected that a new leader was about to emerge. Ella threw one look at my face and ran off. "Just let her go," Dana said behind my back. "What did I do wrong?" I asked. "Absolutely nothing," said Dana. "Now she's even more crazy about you. You got beat up when you tried to protect her. Do you know what that does to a woman?" "When did she have time to go crazy about me?" I asked. "Yeah, since the night you told her how much you enjoyed listening to her talk," she replied. "Rob, do you know what women hear all the time? I mean, didn't you listen to what Dave was saying about Becky? Do you have any idea how much pain she's in right now? Trust me, when it comes to Ella, you can't go wrong." I continued working on the mirror. I secured it and tried to aim the beam at the edge of the cliff and the water. I was starting to remember that we had missed breakfast when I heard a few cautious footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw Ella. She was holding two wide square boards that Dana had prepared for us as plates. On them lay something green and some kind of meat. It was cut into chunks. We ate 3 or 4 pieces and there were cups of berry juice for each of us. She looked at me, then quickly averted her gaze. "What did I do?" I asked. "Rob, your eye," she said, "and your lip." "They'll heal," I said. "But they shouldn't have done that," she said. "I could have fished for him for a couple days and found berries for him. Maybe he would have learned to fish for himself and—" "Or maybe I didn't want to stay away from you for a couple days," I said. Her eyes got really wide, and she had to hide a smile. "The greens are different," she said. "I've seen them growing underwater near where I fish. I had Jill go in the water and cut them down. It looks like cabbage, but it has a slightly different flavor." I realized she wanted to change the subject. "So what kind of meat is it?" I asked. "Try it," she smiled. I took a bite from one of the pieces. It was different from the protein one. It was less fatty and tasted more like chicken, but I knew there were no chickens on the island. "Is that seagull?" I asked, chewing and trying to figure out what the flavor was. She shook her head. "Don't tell me it's a pigeon," I said, taking another bite. "It was caught by Ig," she said. "It's a snake." I quickly spit it out and took a sip of berry juice. "Rob, do you know when I first realized you cared about me?" she asked. I shook my head. "When you told me you wanted me to eat any protein, even if it tasted like fried shit. You didn't say that to anyone else. It was just so important to you that I stay healthy. So now I want you to eat your snake for me. It's not as tasty as fish, but it's protein, and it's better than fried shit." From that moment on, something happened between us. We never talked about it or stated it, but we were together. We also never broke up. Since we didn't know how to store food and preserve it, we started giving the surplus to another group. The first time we arrived with a bucket of fried fish and greens, they pounced on the food and devoured it by the handfuls. Unlike us, they had no idea about sharing or working together. They each just grabbed as much food as they could and retreated. A few days later, Ella and I were sitting on a rock in the morning. She was fishing. We hadn't had sex since we started dating, but at least we'd kissed. So that morning, as she sat fishing and smiled back at me, I knew we'd eventually lie down on the soft grass and make love. "I love you so much," I said. "Not even for this boat," she replied. "What boat?" I asked. I got to my feet and looked at the water, and she was right. It wasn't very big, but it was moving. I ran over to the mirror and shined the beam on the boat. At first I thought it would sail by, but it slowed down, and then Ella and I started jumping up and down to signal them. The boat turned toward us. Jill heard our shouts and ran up to us. As the boat approached the rocks, we saw that it was a very small motorboat. It was probably not more than 10 feet long, and there were already 3 men on board. Ig and Dana came running in. They had heard Ella and me screaming. Ella didn't have time to cover herself with excitement, and Ig's eyes nearly rolled up to his forehead. We decided that we could only send one man with them. It was immediately decided that it should be Jill. They wanted me to go, but I refused. Gil could tell the authorities about the boat, its registration number, insurance information, and other nonsense. They'd also radioed our location to the Coast Guard, but cell phones in that area just didn't work. Why didn't you go? Ella asked, watching Jill pull away on the boat. And didn't leave you behind? I asked. That's never going to happen. Good answer, she said. When Dana and Ig disappeared again to go about their business when they weren't around, Ella and I headed to the other side of the island. As soon as we arrived, everyone gathered around. No sooner had we started talking than there was a slight sigh. I looked up and saw that Natalie had noticed that Ella and I were holding hands. Where's the food? One of the nerds asked. You'll soon have all the food you need, I said. We've been rescued. What? How? Asked Dave. The mirror, I said. Ella and I were fishing on a rock when she spotted a boat. Using the mirror, I signaled her. The boat was too small to take more than one person, so we sent Jill. They are going to send a rescue boat. They were all excited, and we heard a lot of talk about what some of them wanted to do first after they got back. Other things were talked about too. Someone asked if Ella always sits in her underwear. I also heard someone ask what we do on the rocks alone in the mornings. Who cares? Someone else said. It's over. We're going home. A little over 2 hours later, I was standing leaning against the rail of a Great Lakes rescue boat. As I watched the island slowly recede, I could still make out the spot where we had set up camp. I wondered what would become of our little cabin. $1 for your thoughts, said a tiny voice beside me. His harsh British accent made the mispronounced phrase even more unusual. My thoughts are worth at least $5, I said. Can I do the fortune-telling first? She asked. That's a lot of money, especially for a poor librarian. Okay, I said. I've been talking to Dana. She went back to her friends. She and Ig met and talked. He explained to her very nicely that what they had would always be special to him, but it was just something that happened while we were on the island. It would never last in real life. She told him that she absolutely agreed with him and that he was too old for her. So she would go back to being a whore walking around the bars and he would go back to his wife. The island was just an interlude, nothing more, she said, looking at me. I nodded my head. So that's what you've been doing? She asked, trying to think of a good way to tell me about it? Something like that, I said. I watched her try to keep a calm expression on her face. I've been thinking about renting a boat after we get married and coming here for our honeymoon. Only I can't decide if we should invite some friends along. And of course, if we have kids, we should bring them here someday. And of course, the kids I already have might want to see it, depending on which side they take in the divorce. And in the next instant, she came at me with such force that I nearly fell over the railing. I turned around and saw Natalie standing behind me. Ella, do I get a chance to talk to Rob? She asked. Ella only nodded. I'll go and try to comfort poor Dana, she said. Is she on the list? Definitely, I said, and then an idea popped into my head. Rob, what's going on? She asked. You haven't said more than 10 words to me since you let me know you knew what I did. We need to talk about this. I talked to Dana when we were on the island. She told me some things that just don't make sense. I think you have the wrong idea about what happened here. Natalie, as soon as that boat pulls into the dock, I'm filing for divorce. If you tell me what you want to tell me, it will save me time. Let's do it. It means we won't have to waste time doing it later, I said. Okay, Rob. I don't know how you found out, but yes, I cheated on you before we got to the island. But I dropped everything and decided to dedicate the rest of my life to making you happy. That's why we went on that damn boat. I wanted us to fall in love all over again. I left Rob. I was never going to do it again. It had to mean something, she said. Yeah, I said, and she smiled. It didn't mean anything. Mathematically, 0 is something. What else did you want to say? Well, you know, Troy made us all do it with him and the other guys, and even as she said it, she realized I knew she was lying. Oh, no. Nat, how do you think I found out about you having fun with Troy and cheating on me? I asked. Dana told you, right? She said. No, Nat. You're the one who told me, I said. Before you went out with Troy against me, what you did to the captain, I was there in the bushes. I saw the whole thing. I heard you telling him about your affair. Funny how the guy I can't stand cared more about our marriage than you did. I heard him ask you, what about your husband? Rob, I was scared, she whimpered. I wished I had a better chance of surviving. Yeah, but you picked the wrong one, I said. And I suffered for it, Rob, she said. They treated us like whores. Ella only had to do that with you. She must have loved it. Natalie, Ella and I haven't had sex yet, I said. I think we're going to abstain until we get married. You can't be serious, she said. You're not seriously thinking of divorcing me, are you? That's the plan, I said. Just like Steve and Edie's. Rob, Steve and Edie aren't like us at all. They haven't been married that long, and they don't have two kids to explain anything to. So okay, I've had sex with a few guys. The whole time I was messing around with Edie, it was fun. It was just sex. And there were no steady partners. I never embarrassed you or did anything with anyone we knew. So, I said, so it wasn't just your fault, it was mine too, she snapped back. I waited 20 years for you. Every day I was stuck in this house while you went to work. I was bored. I felt like an inferior person. Tell that shit to Oprah or Dr. Phil, I snapped back. After our divorce is final, write a book and host The View. But don't tell me that crap. It's such a cliche. I left the house every day and busted my ass to give you what you wanted. I bought the house in the neighborhood you wanted to live in. I got you the car you wanted to drive. When you ask for shit like that, you have to pay for it. My part of paying for it was that I worked to pay for it. Your part was taking care of the house and watching the kids. If you wanted to change or wanted to get a job yourself, all you had to do was say something. All you had to do was say, honey, I want to get a job and help out. Even if your job only paid for daycare, it would be virtually break even. You can sit here and tell me all these bullshit excuses, but you can't tell me you were bored? She looked at me like she'd never thought about it. Well, what you're doing isn't the same as me, she snapped back. I've had a few innocent, meaningless flings with guys I don't even remember. And you went and found a woman to replace me. I laughed. Are you laughing because you don't think your relationship with Ella is serious? She asked. Okay, how long do you need to spend with her before your wounded pride allows us to be together again? Natalie, Ella can never replace you, I said. She smiled. Ella is younger than you, smarter than you, prettier than you, better built than you've ever been. And the biggest difference and most important is that she believed in me. Before we even met, she listened to me and Troy and decided to be on my side when my own wife didn't. And speaking of timing, I want to spend the rest of my life with her. What will we tell our friends? What will we tell the kids? She whined. I don't want to end up like Edie. You can tell them anything you want, I said. I'm going to tell them the truth. As soon as we entered the docks, the real race was on. I'd already told Natalie that I intended to keep the house, so she needed to make other arrangements. And since she still couldn't afford the mortgage without a job and substantial child support, she agreed. She decided to move in with her parents and pick up her stuff on Saturday. I got in my Mustang and drove home. While I was there, I called the same divorce attorney Steve had used. Steve ended up paying Edie almost nothing, and that's what I was hoping for too. I had one more trick up my sleeve, two to be exact. While I was busy splitting up bank accounts and canceling all the credit cards Natalie had used, she chose another tactic. She called our kids and told them a bunch of ridiculous lies. She hired her own attorney and tried to challenge every agreement I proposed. We went to a psychologist. Even our therapist was shocked by Natalie's actions. Counseling was unsuccessful, but it took 8 weeks. As a last attempt to avoid going to court, we went to arbitration. I finally realized what Natalie was trying to accomplish. Edie was suing Steve. She decided that if she couldn't save their marriage, she would get as much money as she could. Then she would use that money to sleep with all the guys she wanted. The judge didn't give her as much as she expected, and even then it was limited to 2 years. After a few months of having all the fun she wanted, Edie found that being a full-time whore wasn't as much fun as she thought it would be. Plus, she was lonely and money was tight. Natalie saw this and tried to act differently. She was doing everything she could to delay the divorce as long as possible. She thought that if she could hold out long enough, I would take her back. She also had our children, her parents, and many of our friends to whom she told the same lies, trying to convince me to get back together with her. I begged her to accept one of my settlement offers just to get it over with. The arbitrator was starting to get frustrated with Natalie's behavior as well. Eventually, he simply asked her what she wanted, figuring that was a good place to start the negotiations. Natalie continued to make the most outrageous demands and stated that if she couldn't have it, she wanted to stay married. One of her demands was $2 million a year for 10 years. Since I make less than $100,000 a year, this was ridiculous. The arbitrator wrote a note to the judge about Natalie's behavior and sent us back to court. Natalie didn't realize it, but going to court was the worst option for her and the best option for me. Our children, now adults, came to court. None of them had spoken to me since Natalie had spewed her crap on them. There in the courtroom, in the presence of our parents and children, Natalie made her final statement. The first witness my attorney called was Natalie's former friend Edie. By the time Edie finished telling me about what Nat had been doing behind my back, my son was furious and my daughter was crying. Neither of them believed Nat's story anymore. When the second witness was called, Natalie squirmed even more in her chair. She asked her lawyer not to let Troy testify, but the judge wanted to hear what he had to say. When Troy finished laying out everything Natalie had done on the island, even I was stunned. The judge had used all of his authority in determining the settlement. According to state rules, all property must be divided equally, but he was given a little leeway. I had already given Natalie half of the checking and savings accounts and allowed her to keep all the things she wanted in the house. He let her keep the car, let me buy her out of the mortgage, and gave her a total of $1 a week for 2 years as alimony. Natalie had already spent the money from our checking and savings accounts that she had been given, and it put her in a difficult situation. Since we took out a second mortgage to provide college tuition for both kids, we didn't have much equity in the house. Natalie had to pay her own legal fees, and although her attorney stretched out the divorce at Natalie's request, he still charged her for her time. In the end, Natalie was left on the losing end. Our house was worth $110,000. We owed $30 on it, another $40 on the second mortgage. So our total equity in the house was $40,000. I gave Natalie $20,000. She owed her attorney $22,000. To help her, I offered to pay her all of her child support in a lump sum. I gave her 5 crisp $20 bills and 16 quarters and left. Nearly 6 months after I got out of court, I found myself back on the docks. As Ella and I looked at the huge ship moored there, she squeezed my hand. "Daddy, Ella!" shouted someone behind us. My daughter, Susan, ran up and hugged us both. She introduced us to a small, quiet man who turned out to be her boyfriend and boarded the ship. Her grandparents on both sides were already on board. It still shocked me that I remained relatively close to Natalie's parents, but after all, they were my children's grandparents. Ig and his wife smiled at me from the upper deck. I shook my head, and Ella nudged me with her elbow. "Be polite," she said. Dana came in with a guy who looked like Jill. How they ended up together would have to be explained later. Troy and Dave came in, both accompanied by pretty college girls. The events on the island had changed a lot of things in their lives. The nerds arrived alone. My son was already on the island. He chartered a helicopter and flew there. It was part of our backup plan. The only people who were with us on the island and not in attendance were Dana's 3 girlfriends. They all felt they had been mistreated there and didn't want to bring it up. And of course, there was no Natalie. Not that she didn't want to attend, but things hadn't gone well for Nat after our divorce. Most of the men she dated weren't very good. Also, the money for her secretarial job didn't pay very well, so she couldn't afford a nice dress. But the most important reason was that she was in prison. She felt betrayed by Edie because of her testimony in court. Edie, in turn, felt abandoned by Natalie during her own divorce, so although they were birds of the same feather, they very rarely saw each other. A few nights ago, however, they went to the same bar and got into a fight over the same guy. The judge gave them each a week in jail for defacing property, disturbing the peace, mutual assault, and public drunkenness. As the big ship pulled away from the dock, a second smaller ship followed us at a distance. I wanted to see our little island again. I wanted us to get married there, and while everyone else slept in comfort on the ship, Ella and I would spend the first night of our honeymoon in our shawl. Then we'd get on the helicopter and fly back in time to have a real honeymoon in Vegas. $1 for your thoughts, Ella said, sitting next to me. Oh, I don't have to pay for them anymore. We're getting married in a couple hours and we'll be together forever. I would never do anything to lose you. I love you too much. I could listen to you talk forever, I said. But what I'm really remembering is how we fought with Troy over you on the island. Do you remember what I called that place? Yeah, you called it Gilligan's Island, she said, laughing. No, I was talking about the land of Gil, Ig, and me. Maybe the three of us should find out how to buy it. Maybe not, she said. But we lived happily ever after. The end. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel and watch for the next video.